And that was President Obama live from the White House. Joining us now to talk about the president's actions are Kathleen Arnold. She's a visiting professor of political science at DePaul University. Arnold is a political theorist and immigration expert who has written 4 books about immigration, including American Immigration After 1996, The Shifting Ground of Political Inclusion, and her forthcoming work, Contemporary Immigration in America, a state-by-state encyclopedia. And David Applegate, he's a trial lawyer and partner at the law firm of Williams, Montgomery & John Limited. He's also a policy advisor for legal affairs for the Heartland Institute and serves on the executive committee of the Chicago Lawyers chapter of the Federalist Society. And welcome both of you to Chicago tonight. First of all, let's take a quick review of what the president is proposing, and this is in order that the president laid out. Number 1, he would crack down on illegal immigration at the border. He would focus on deporting felons, not families. The executive order would emphasize conducting criminal background checks. And perhaps the key portion of what he said, if a parent of a U.S. citizen has lived here for more than 5 years, there would be no deportation for 3 years. Kathleen Arnold, just very quickly, your reaction to what the president had to say.
He said exactly what was expected. So I was paying more attention to the language he was using and how he was trying to convince the American public, but I think everything was exactly what we thought. The one disappointment on the ground in Chicago is that more people aren't going to be eligible, that it will just be a limited group of people.
Because the estimate is that there's roughly 11 million plus undocumented immigrants in this country, and the steps that he announced today would affect 5 million, more or less. David Applegate, your quick reaction to what the president had to say before we get into some of the specific points.
My reaction was that it was a generally good speech by this president. Will not go down in history as one of the great examples or exemplars of presidential oratory. I think it would have made an excellent speech on the floor of the Senate on policy grounds, and I think that what eluded the president in his speech tonight was really the constitutional issues that his actions are raising.
And how about, well, you know, since you raised that, does the president have the legal authority to do what he's proposing? And we'll begin with you, David Applegate.
In my opinion, and based on my understanding of what the proposal includes, no. The Constitution is very clear in its separation of powers that the legislative power is invested in the legislature, the House of Representatives and the Senate, both of which, since the 17th Amendment, have been elected by the people. The president's duty, which he takes an oath to enforce, is to see that those laws are faithfully executed and, of course, to protect and defend and preserve the Constitution to the best of his ability. And what he is doing is treading in an area that the Supreme Court has said since the 1890s is exclusively the province of Congress. It's determining who should be naturalized and who should be deported.
Kathleen Arnold, does the president have the legal authority to do what he's proposing, in your opinion?
I believe he does. I think the issue is, do we want the presidency to have this sort of power? But Obama is certainly not the first person to exercise it. Back to the 1890s, actually, the plenary power doctrine was introduced by the Supreme Court for the entire federal government, which includes the president, not just Congress.
And what does that mean?
So the plenary power doctrine argues, and it's a bit ironic because the Supreme Court declares this, and nevertheless is arguing that all matters of immigration should be decided by the federal government, which means the executive and Congress. They are thereby stating that the Supreme Court does not have purview over matters of immigration. So the irony is that the Supreme Court is creating this doctrine and then opting out of it, and then has several cases up through the 1950s that continue to assert plenary power, and actually in the 1990s this power was strengthened. So.
How about the whole issue, and the president alluded to this, the fact that other presidents have tweaked immigration policy. To what extent does his authority to do what he's proposing rest with that precedent? David Applegate.
First of all, it's simply a canard that other presidents have done what he has done in the immigration area, particularly recently. The president alluded to have not having not done much for decades. But in 1986, President Ronald Reagan signed what was actually a bipartisan, bicameral bill, the Simpson-Mazzoli Act, where we had a Republican United States Senator from out west, Wyoming, and we had a Democratic representative in the House from Kentucky, co-sponsored this resolution. And like the President's proposal tonight, its main focus was on amnesty, letting people illegally here stay here.
And the President, just to interrupt, the President said, at least his position was, this is not an amnesty, this is strictly a sort of a temporary 3-year abeyance of deportation.
Right, and he says this isn't going to apply in the future and we're not going to give citizenship. But what a terrible thing that would be, Phil, to let people come into this country, say you're legally here, but say, no, you don't have a future path to citizenship. Now, I'm an open immigration person, but as I said in my first remarks, this is an excellent political speech, and this is an excellent argument to make on the floor of the Senate or the floor of the House. But the President simply cannot say to Congress that you didn't do what I wanted, so I get to do it. What President Reagan did and what President George W. Bush did was in line with the legislation that was passed, where Congress had said, we are going to let people who have been here for a certain time stay here, but it forgot about their children.
So that was an amnesty. That was clearly an amnesty, piece of amnesty legislation. Kathleen Arnold, is it a meaningful distinction that do you buy what the President said, that this is not amnesty, it's not going to lead to citizenship, it's simply delaying deportation for 3 years for people who fall into this category?
Yes, I mean, historical precedent, if the 1986 IRCA is the precedent, which is the Immigration Reform and Control Act, granted amnesty for one time. If that is our reference point, this is not amnesty. It does put people in a temporary holding position, which is true. But if you know...
Does that amount to an amnesty?
Absolutely not. What it does is it buys time for people who need that time. And our system needs the time to review its own processes because something's obviously not working. People are afraid. They are in the shadows. I think it's worth it.
And what happens then in 3 years? We're going to deport these people. If we don't have the resources to deport 11 million people now, we're certainly not going to have the resources to deport 11+ million people, which, by the way, no one is advocating. Absolutely no one in the House is calling for that. That is not going to happen. That is a false choice, and it's the kind of false choice that this President in particular seems to like to make.
Does this 3 years give Congress the opportunity to come up with something comprehensive? We heard the President invite Congress to come up with something, and then he would sign it, and all this executive order stuff would go away.
And the President should be, if he is sincere about that invitation, he should say, look, I can wait 6 weeks until the new Congress assembles, rather than doing this immediately after an election and during a lame duck session.
Kathleen Arnold, how about that? Why doesn't the President wait for 6 weeks until the new Congress is in?
It's purely politically provocative.
I don't think he has had a good opportunity. He's had 6 years. The American public's waited 6 years for some sort of decision. There have been decent proposals that were not passed, and they were bipartisan. And this is a good moment. Obama has heard from a number of people on the ground, including Luis Gutierrez and others, about the hardship people are going through. The lives are in the balance. Parents are being split apart from their children. This is not tax reform or something that could be modified. People's lives are at stake.
David Applegate, how about the moral argument that the President alluded to, referring to families and such?
The moral argument is wonderful. And as I said earlier, I believe in an open immigration system. My proposal, were I emperor, would be to let any non-criminal into the country who wants to come into this country to make a better life for his or herself or family. And my ancestors are immigrants. I presume your ancestors are immigrants.
Absolutely.
The President's absolutely right about that. But we have a structure, we have a system for doing that. And if the President has waited 6 years during which this has not been a major priority, he can certainly wait another 6 weeks. For the Congress that the people just elected, by the way, when the president said his policies were on the ballot, you are voting on my policies.
What, if anything, can the opponents do to prevent this from happening, Kathleen Arnold?
So they have three options as far as it seems. They could find something in legislation and then argue that Obama has somehow preempted congressional authority or legislative, some sort of legislative jurisdiction. That's unlikely. The second thing that they'll probably do is try to defund any sort of program that's going to help this sort of temporary holding process that he's proposing. The third thing they can do that I don't think they're going to do is to shut down the government, but that's the threat, obviously.
Could there be a backlash to negative reaction to the president's proposal, David?
There's certainly going to be a backlash in the House, likely going to have some backlash in the Senate. I don't think from the American people there's going to be a huge backlash.
You know, one Republican senator from Oklahoma predicted today that there could be violent reactions against the president's move and instances of anarchy and violence. Do you agree with that? Do you see that?
But I don't know, maybe there's somebody in Oklahoma who's going to get upset because his neighbor has too many people working in the backyard. But no, I don't see that happening. I think the president is right about this being a welcoming country. I think the way to go about it is to let Congress do its job in the new session with the newly elected Congress.
That's where we'll have to leave it. Kathleen Arnold and David Applegate, thank you both for being here. Very much appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.